first of all, I want to thank Laurent for having me here today and also for having me be involved in the world of the bonobos, and also Sue for bringing Kanzi, Pambanisha, and Yoda and the whole family to all of us, and my condolences to you in particular. So I'm a literary theorist and trauma theorist, and so what I will say will come from that perspective, and we'll probably use a somewhat different language for some of the things that Paul Thibault has already said. I just wanted to start by playing a little bit of a video from Laurent's encounter with Kanzi after about, I think it had been about 6 years, 7 years, 10 since you'd seen him. Okay, when we were in Des Moines last year.
So he pointed to Jan into the door.
Yeah. Okay. That's me. And again, Laurent and Kanzi. So I'm going to speak briefly today about the enigma of a unique kind of encounter, the encounter between Sue, Laurent, and those who worked with Kanzi and his family, as well as my own encounter with Kanzi and Yoda. I use the word encounter to distinguish what has impacted me and drawn me to this study and to meeting Kanzi and Yoda from other kinds of objects of study. I do not mean to talk about, for example, the bonobos as an object of study in their social behavior, in their language, or tool-making capabilities, or from a philosophical perspective to examine the difference or border between the human and non-human. The word encounter signifies for me something that can never precisely be an object of study. It is rather the face-to-face meeting point between two creatures who are very close and also very different, but who are communicating, touching each other emotionally, linguistically, bodily, and ethically, and whose very meeting may in fact alter the so-called nature of each. In the case of the bonobos, this encounter is mediated in part through their use of learned English with lexicograms and spoken words. So the meeting point is in part so powerful because it takes place at the borderline or borderland, typically used to distinguish humans and non-humans, that is, human language. But what happens at this meeting point, this site of encounter, I believe, so affects our own experience that it undoes the possibility of turning it into the object of any single discipline. It so impacts our sense of ourselves as humans who study others that we cannot come out of this encounter in the same manner we went in. It calls out for study, for research, but also undoes the premises of each discipline, even as it demands their study and attention. It undoes the borders of these disciplines, perhaps, or at the very least calls upon them to speak to each other in new ways. I recall in this context something that was said to me in another context in an interview with the psychoanalysts Françoise Devoine and Jean-Max Gaudier, who worked with patients suffering from trauma-induced psychosis, people whom they called research is into uninscribed histories. They said, these patients undo your theories. You come to them with your theory, but they always show the limits of them. At some point, you will always fall out of your chair. And this is the beginning of learning from them. With the bonobos as well, I think that to capture, or precisely not to capture, but to bear witness to the nature of this encounter, we must also fall out of our theories and search for a language or a series of languages, or the meeting point between languages, where they all fail and all create something new. In fact, my own entry into this world came from the intersecting worlds of bonobo research and trauma. I think it was 2017 that you brought Sue, Laurent brought Sue Savage-Rambaud to speak at a conference organized on the bonobos, language and condition. I was compelled by two things, seeing her interaction with Kanzi and the other language bonobos and their capacity to communicate with her in lexicograms and speech, and hearing her story of being ripped away from the lab suddenly and their apparent, the bonobos' apparent isolation from her family, and indeed much of the language environment they had known for decades. Both the encounter and what seemed like a story of trauma called out together, I thought, for a mode of testimony like those Holocaust survivors have in video testimonies projects, communicating experiences that have no direct form of discourse. As Itai has said, there was evidence already that bonobos could testify to their past experiences. We were unable to get into the lab then, but did interview Sue, her sister Liz, who has now died, and many others associated with the lab who knew Kanzi and his family, including Itai. Edited by Laurent, these videos became the Ape Testimony Archive at Cornell, which is available online. What is striking for me about these videos is how they bear witness to what in these encounters with the bonobos cannot be reduced to scientific replicable experiments, what often takes the form of anecdote, and what passes on emotional, psychological, and linguistic experiences that have no precise language. For example, as Laurent has noted, Kanzi learned language by overhearing what his adoptive mother Matata was being taught, or Yoda suddenly noted that Laurent was wearing a shirt that was the same as Yoda's piece of cloth that he was playing with at the time when he met Laurent. This latter moment not only illustrates a skill that might be studied, it is so striking because it is also, one might say, a particular kind of address, and one that holds in it so many of the questions we would ask about the bonobos. Not only what Yoda means by same, does he really understand sameness, and is it about only the cloth? But also, why is he addressing this insight, same, to Laurent? Is this about the sameness he feels with Laurent? What kind of an address is it? I would note that Sue, in hearing Laurent retell this story to me in front of her, noted with bemusement that Yoda may also have been telling Laurent that he, Laurent, was not the only bright boy in the room, and Yoda had some skills of his own. So what does same mean then? I use the word address here because I think it helps to, or reaches towards, something that is so hard to capture in speaking about these encounters. Sue's work, as Laurent has noted, exceeded typical scientific protocols by providing full immersion over many years, decades, of living with the bonobos in a culturally rich, shared, symbolic environment in which there wasn't only English, but also long-term relationships across the species barriers. In one of our interviews, Sue's sister Liz's husband told us that their daughter's first memory was of having her diapers changed by Pambanisha. Sue spoke of bicultural child raising of both bonobo and human infants and toddlers. So the context in which communication arose was not simply about a scientist testing a subject. There were desires and needs and loves and other forms of interaction and motivation that produced what Sue named in various ways, and I would call forms of address. And I think this links to what Paul Thibault was saying about the interactive forms. An aspect of the encounter between two beings communicating with each other that cannot be grasped simply in psychological, affective, linguistic, or rhetorical terms. While address is used in philosophy, trauma studies, linguistics, and rhetoric, it eludes precise definition. But what we can say is that many fields in relation to work on bonobos and other non-human animals have eliminated precisely this element when they speak of these creatures and their impact on us. Or rather, they eliminate their impact on us in order to turn the encounter into an object of study that does not undo the field of vision or comprehension of the researcher. For this reason, the philosopher Jacques Derrida would suggest that Western philosophy had been constituted on the very elimination of the non-human animal as one who could address the philosopher. What would it mean for philosophy, asked, if the animal, quote unquote, as non-human animals have been called, were truly allowed not only to be seen and spoken of by us, but to address us? The literary theorist and rhetorical theorist Paul Deman asks a related question, I think, when he asked what it would mean if the face of the human were constituted not as a natural face that looks upon others, but is given to us by a language that is not simply possessed by us, and that both constitutes figures and disfigures us. In my own meeting with Kanzi and Yoda last year, made possible by Laurent's inviting me to participate in his study of painting and language in bonobos, this question of address arose in a different way, one influenced by my work on trauma and related to my first inspiration to work on bonobos when I asked Laurent if we could do testimonies with them about their experience of being separated from Sue. On the one hand, the immediate, powerful, and forever impactful first moment of meeting with Yoda will forever stay with me. His running up to the window, his putting his lips against it to kiss me. When we first gave Yoda paints after he'd used the canvas as a toy to slide around on, he chose the red paints, painted his lips, and ran up to the window to give me a big kiss, leaving lip paint on the glass, which I found very moving, given that he had also struck me as somewhat depressed. I felt that he related to me more than Kanzi did, and I was startled to find out later that Sue had predicted that this would happen. In the case of Laurent, Kanzi immediately recognized his friend, whom he hadn't seen for almost a decade, and danced with him. And that's the video I showed a little of. He really seemed to be bonded with him to address him meaningfully. Kanzi also did something I had read about, but was quite remarkable to experience, and I think what Dave called directing. He went to the lexigram board and pointed to chase and made me and Laurent chase each other, then pointed to tickle and made us tickle each other. And then when we stopped, he made a gesture insisting that we do it again. What was he doing in observing us, or was he addressing us in some way? These are anecdotes, but they also say something of what it feels like to experience being addressed by the bonobos. And I'd like just to say that in these studies, it'd be reductive to claim that it is only humans desiring the contact with the bonobos. They also seem to want to communicate as well, which also shifts some of the philosophical and ethical questions. Moreover, Kanzi has been described, for example, by Laurent today, as performing his own fame as a kind of representative of the skills of the bonobos. So what was he telling us? Was he telling us something like this? At the same time, I felt, and I believe Laurent did too, that the world in which the bonobos were now living was not an environment filled with possibilities of true address, and that the painting experiment, which had to be carried out by the aides there, would be affected by this. Why would the apes want to paint just to have something checked off on an experimental study? In fact, what I experienced here returned me to the words of Dory Laub writing about the world of the Holocaust, also in terms of a particular problem of address. The Holocaust, he said, was a world, quote, in which there was no one to say thou, unquote. The Jews and other victims were not considered either addressees or able to address, so they could not address others and be heard. They could not be listened to. I felt that this was a challenge for the bonobos. Also, the question arose, to whom could they truly address themselves in this new environment, devoid of the previous conditions of communication, interaction, language, and love, or deep relationship? And what did it mean ethically to enter that environment briefly, hoping to communicate, but also unable to stay? How do we listen now to these creatures for whom the possibility of address may in many ways have been cut off? Last paragraph. I think this last question is now, for me, the complex question and command that remains after Kanzi's sudden and devastating death, and in light of Yoda's undoubted loneliness, and in light of the fact that for ethical reasons, we will not be studying more captive bonobos in the same way, I assume. It is also a question that I think resonates more largely in our work. How can we learn to listen to an address that I think still resonates with us, but across the barriers of understanding, of its increasing circumstantial impossibility, of the philosophical, linguistic, humanistic, as we say, and ethical complexities raised by the address of these animals to us? The philosopher Levinas asked about the ethical nature of an address of the other that undoes who we are, even as we listen, and demands a response we may not be able to fulfill. But the bonobos continue to demand, I think, that we reach for all of the ways our various languages, cognitive studies, primatology, linguistics, translation theory, literary theory, trauma theory, ethics, etc., can be recreated around this profound and continuingly baffling encounter that is Kanzi's legacy to us. Thank you.